If you ask the mainstream lore community why the Primarchs were scattered across the galaxy, they will give you a soap opera. They will tell you that Erda, the genetic mother of the Primarchs, was so horrified by the Emperor's cold parenting that she threw her own children into the warp to save them. It's a neat, tragic story. It's also a complete misunderstanding of how the Emperor operates. The Emperor didn't lose his sons to a mother's grief. He watched her do it. To understand why, you first need to understand who Erda actually is in canon, not the summarized version, the full one. She isn't a minor character slotted into the Horus Heresy to add maternal complexity. She is a Perpetual, an immortal human who resurrects after death, the same fundamental biological category as the Emperor himself. She met the man who would later be known as Neoth, the Emperor's earliest recorded name, from the age of the First Cities, when he was still a warlord king operating in antiquity, long before he had a throne, or a title, or a golden room on Terra. She contributed her own genetic material to the Primarch project, making her their biological mother in the most literal available sense. The lore positions their relationship as extended and significant. The only person who served as his equal partner across a meaningful span of his long life. The only one who came close to what you might call a life mate. Her introduction to the lore arrived in 2 stages, and the community collapses these together in ways that blur the argument. Chris Raitt named and characterized her in Valdor, Birth of the Imperium in 2019, set during the transitional period between the Unification Wars and the early Imperium, before the Crusade, before the Heresy, back when the shape of what the Imperium would become was still being fought over in politics and back rooms and gene labs beneath the Himalayan mountains. She was there for all of it. She helped design what the Primarchs were going to be. Her role in the scattering itself was confirmed years later in Dan Abnett's Saturnine, the 4th Siege of Terra novel, published in 2020, when she confessed to the Perpetual John Grammaticus during the final burning days of the Siege of Terra itself. That confession is the foundation of the mainstream story. And it's worth sitting with what it actually contains, because the community mostly passes over it to reach the emotional conclusion. Erda told Grammaticus she opened the way. She said she sabotaged the protections around the facility. She did it, she said, to save her children from the fate the Emperor intended for them. She wanted to give them lives of their own, outside his machinery, outside the Great Crusade's appetite for conquest and compliance. She believed she was protecting them from becoming weapons. The lore community largely accepted her testimony as the authoritative account of events. It shouldn't have done so. Not because Erda is lying. She almost certainly believes every word she said to Grammaticus, but because she is the worst possible witness to her own role in this story. She is the subject of the trap, not the architect of it. And before we can prove that, we need to be precise about what she actually did and what she didn't. Start with the mechanism, because the mainstream version gets this wrong in a way that matters. Erda didn't physically take 20 gestation pods and hurl them into the warp. She wasn't strong enough to do that, and the architecture of the act wasn't within her specific capabilities regardless of her power level. What she did was sabotage the protective wards and Geller field equivalents surrounding the Primarch gestation facility beneath the Himalayan mountains. She opened the door. She dismantled the threshold between the facility and the warp. She made the contents of that facility accessible to something that had been pressing against the boundary from the other side for a very long time.
The Chaos Gods walked through. In Warhawk, and this detail is critical, the picture that emerges is that Erda was unwittingly used by the Chaos Gods to commit the act. She thought she was executing her own plan. She believed she was the one making the strategic decision that changed everything. She was executing someone else's design without knowing it.
The question the mainstream narrative never asks is, whose design was it ultimately serving? Because there were at minimum 3 parties with significant interest in what happened to those 20 gestation pods: Erda, the Chaos Gods, and the Emperor. And only one of them walked away from the event in a position to benefit from the outcome long-term. In Warhawk, Erda herself says, "I acted to prevent an escalation, something terribly wrong, a twisting of what our ascension was supposed to be. I never acted to aid your—" She stops. She doesn't finish the sentence. That ellipsis matters. It's the gap between what she intended and what she understood about what actually happened. She believed she was the protagonist. She believed she was the one who had chosen. And she has spent whatever portion of her immortal life followed in the corrosive weight of guilt that belongs specifically to someone who can't reconcile what they meant to do with what they actually did. She acknowledges the catastrophic consequences. She does not fully acknowledge her own role within the larger mechanics of what was set in motion that night. The gap between her self-narrative and the observable reality is the argument. The mainstream story asks you to believe that the Emperor was genuinely helpless during and immediately after the scattering. This belief requires ignoring what was actually happening in those moments. Not in abstract, but in specific physical and psychic terms that the Lexicanum records precisely. When the warp vortex tore through the facility, 20 gestation pods ripped from their housing by forces that the Primarch's own nascent psychic presence had attracted or amplified, the structure began to fail. The underground roof of a facility buried beneath mountains began to collapse inward. The workers inside were going to die. The irreplaceable research data accumulated over decades of the Primarch project was going to be destroyed. Everything that could be salvaged from the wreckage of the project was about to be consumed by falling stone and warp energy simultaneously. The Emperor held up the roof. With his psychic power alone, he suspended the physical collapse of an underground facility while a warp vortex was operating inside it, and he held it long enough for every vault worker and all of their research data to be safely evacuated. Not some of the workers, not most of the data, all of them, every person, every file. He conducted a complete structured rescue of both the living personnel and the irreplaceable genetic records of his greatest project, simultaneously, while 20 demigod-class entities were being torn from the facility around him. He saved the people. He saved the data. He didn't stop the scattering. Immediately after, not days later, not weeks in the aftermath, Malkador the Sigillite and Constantine Valdor believed the Primarchs dead or corrupted. The most powerful psyker in human history sensed their echoes in the warp and knew they were still alive. The Lexicanum records Malkador's surprise when the Emperor began referring to the lost Primarchs as his sons. A small, intimate adjustment of language that Valdor interpreted as an unusual display of suppressed human emotion suddenly surfacing under grief. Neither of them understood what they were actually seeing. They were watching a man adjust his plan. He knew they were alive within moments of the event.
While the 2 men who knew him best in the entire Imperium were already composing their grief, the Emperor was sensing the location of his assets in the warp and beginning to calculate what came next. He held the roof up. He walked the workers out. He archived the data. And then he started building 20 Space Marine legions, 1 per Primarch, constructed from the genetic material he had just finished evacuating, as if following a contingency document he had prepared and set aside against precisely this eventuality. That isn't what helplessness looks like. That isn't what surprise looks like. Surprise is losing the data. Surprise is failing to evacuate the workers.
Surprise isn't pivoting immediately and cleanly to the next stage of the plan while your closest advisors are still absorbing the shock of the first stage ending. Now apply what we know about his precognitive ability, because the community tends toward two extremes on this, and both of them misread the canon. Aaron Dembski-Bowden establishes the Emperor's foresight specifically in Master of Mankind, through a direct conversation between the Emperor and Tribune Ra Endymion. The Emperor does not see the future as a guaranteed sequence of events. He sees it as a destination. He perceives broad trajectories, probable endpoints, the general shape of where things are heading. What he can't guarantee is the specific sequence of steps between the present and the outcome he's working toward. His vision of the warp and of future possibility is probabilistic, the kind of intelligence that tells you where a river is going while leaving the precise path of every current uncertain. He says it himself in that conversation. He can't see into the skeins of fate. He can't see what might have changed. He sees what could be, not what will be. This is the honest version of the precognition argument. The Emperor almost certainly didn't have a frame-by-frame preview of the night Erda opened the wards. He couldn't have known the exact moment she would act. He couldn't have predetermined the specific worlds the pods would land on. The Chaos God's direct interference in warp mechanics is precisely the category of event most capable of disrupting probabilistic foresight, since chaos operates by subverting the kind of pattern recognition that foresight relies on. But ask a different question. The question isn't, did the Emperor script every detail of the scattering? The question is, did the Emperor, a being with nearly 40,000 years of experience reading human nature and strategic systems, need to script every detail in order to allow the outcome? He had identified Erda as a being of extraordinary power and deep maternal investment in the Primarchs. He knew she was horrified by what he planned to do with them. He knew she had the technical knowledge and the facility access to compromise the project. He maintained that arrangement, her presence, her access, her ongoing emotional crisis about the fate of her children, rather than removing any of the variables. He kept her close. He kept her informed. He kept her in the building. The pattern of behavior that explains this is the Thunder Warriors, and you can't understand the Erda argument without the Thunder Warriors first. Before the Astartes, before the Primarchs, the Emperor's unification wars were fought by the Thunder Warriors. Gene-enhanced soldiers constructed for the specific purpose of conquering Terra during the violence of the Age of Strife. Brutal, effective, and genuinely loyal to the man who made them. They won battles that standard troops couldn't. They broke enemy fortifications that should have held. They died for him in numbers, and they fought on, and they gave him Terra. The official imperial record, preserved in the archives, states that the last of the legendary Thunder Warriors died heroically during the final battle of the Unification Wars at Mount Ararat in 669, M30. It's a clean narrative.
It gives them the ending they deserved. It's also, in the specific technical sense, a lie. Chris Wright's Valdor, Birth of the Imperium documents what actually happened. The short work Dreams of Unity corroborates it. Surviving Thunder Warriors were systematically hunted down and killed by the Custodian Guard after the Unification Wars ended. Not one clean battle, a program, an organized, deliberate culling of people who had bled for the Emperor and won him the planet he stood on. The reason the Emperor gave, canonically, was biological and strategic. The Thunder Warriors were psychologically unstable. They were degenerating faster than anticipated, and they were uniquely susceptible to chaos corruption,
more so than the Astartes who replaced them, more so than almost any other class of engineered warrior he had ever produced. He didn't kill them because they had become incompetent. He killed them because leaving them alive was a strategic liability that would eventually produce a catastrophic failure case. A chaos-corrupted thunder warrior, or several, operating somewhere in the Imperium he was trying to build. He falsified the record afterward. They ended in glory, officially. He gave them a clean story because he owed them something, and the something he could give them was a lie that let them die as heroes rather than as discarded tools. This is what the Emperor does when an asset has served its purpose and now represents an ongoing risk. He disposes of it cleanly. He plans the disposal in advance. He creates the conditions that allow it to happen without appearing personally culpable. And then he gives the asset a story that makes the disposal look like something else. He has done this more than once. He is very good at it. The Primarchs themselves have a direct canon statement about their status as assets. In Master of Mankind, Archon Land asks the Emperor why he allows the Primarchs to call him father. The Emperor's response makes his view of them plain. They are warlords, generals, tools bred to serve a purpose, just as the legions were bred to serve a purpose. He then describes a children's story about a wooden puppet that wishes to be human, and notes it's natural for a creation to call its creator father. The implication isn't ambiguous. The sentiment the Primarchs experience toward him is comprehensible and even useful, but it does not reflect his actual relationship with them. They are instruments. He made them to be used. The question of what makes the best instrument is therefore a question he would have been applying to this specific design problem. 20 demigods raised in a controlled facility on Terra, protected from genuine hardship, educated by tutors and shaped by structured training in a safe environment, or 20 demigods who each fought their way to the top of some of the most dangerous and demanding worlds in the galaxy before he arrived to collect them. If you are building the army that will reconquer a hostile galaxy, that question has an answer, and it isn't the laboratory. Malcador himself confirmed part of this calculation in a statement the Lexicanum records with some ambiguity around its full veracity. According to Malcador, both he and the Emperor had deliberately planned to agitate the Primarchs and turn them against one another. The goal was to use the resulting conflict to purge the unmanageable ones, exactly as the Thunder Warriors had been purged. The Horus Heresy, in this account, wasn't a catastrophic deviation from the plan. It was a version of the plan, executed more destructively than intended because the ruinous powers intervened before the engineering was complete. He and the Emperor had already done the math on acceptable losses. Some Primarchs wouldn't survive the process. The ones who did would be precisely the instruments required. 3 of the Primarchs figured this out independently.
Conrad Kurz, Robute Gilliman,
and Sanguinius reportedly each arrived at the conclusion that the scattering and their upbringing on distant worlds had been engineered by the Emperor. 3 beings, separately, with no coordinated discussion of the theory. Kurz was a prophetic monster whose visions of terrible futures rarely missed their mark. Gilliman was the most analytically capable strategic mind in all of the legions, the man who could extract accurate conclusions from fragmentary information as a baseline cognitive function. Sanguinius was a being of extraordinary psychic sensitivity who could see forward in ways that frightened even other Primarchs. All 3, the same conclusion. The Discovery timeline is the part of this argument that should have ended the mainstream narrative years ago, and it didn't because it requires holding 2 facts in tension simultaneously. Horus was found on Thonia in 801.M30, the first Primarch discovered. Alpharius was found last, in 981.M30, the 20th. That is a span of 180 years across the Great Crusade, involving real exploration, genuine compliance campaigns, and incremental contact with scattered human worlds across the galaxy. The Emperor didn't have a map with 20 exact coordinates pinned on it. The community sometimes argues this, that he simply knew where they were and sent each legion directly to the right planet, and the Discovery timeline makes this specific claim untenable. A direct retrieval from 20 known locations does not take 180 years. But the absence of a perfect map isn't the same as ignorance. The Bell of Lost Souls put their finger on the specific detail that makes the Discovery sequence strange in an analysis of the scattering theories. The Emperor arrived at each Primarch's world at a pivotal moment in that Primarch's life. When he found Angron on Nuceria, Angron was standing in the wreckage of a final rebellion, preparing to die alongside the enslaved gladiators who had become his family, the last act of a man who had stopped believing he would survive to see anything else. When he found Mortarion on Barbarus, the Death Guard Primarch was preparing for the culminating battle against the Overlord Psyker who had dominated the planet's population for Mortarion's entire conscious life, the final confrontation he had been building towards since childhood. When he found Jagatai Khan on Chagoras, the Khan had just finished unifying his world, standing at the peak of what his world could make him. These aren't random arrival moments. These are dramatic inflection points. The Emperor appeared when the instrument was finished being forged, not before, not in the middle of the process. He collected each Primarch at the maximum of what their environment had produced. The geographic sequence of discoveries adds a specific texture to this. Sanguinius was found on Baal, on a world significantly further from Terra than Nuceria. Angron, on Nuceria, considerably closer by galactic terms, was found later. Guilliman on Macragge, almost certainly the furthest Primarch homeworld from Terra in the eastern fringe, was found in 837.M30. Corax was the 17th Primarch discovered, found after Guilliman, who had been reached deep in the eastern fringe years earlier. If this were a standard exploratory search radiating outward from Terra, Guilliman would have been among the last found. The geographic sequence does not match any radiating search pattern. It follows a different order, and the logic that order obeys is only visible if the decision of when to collect each Primarch was driven by something other than proximity or chance of encounter. The novel Wolfsbane contains the sequence that frames this most clearly in canonical terms.
During a weird journey, a passage into the warp with deliberate visionary intent, Leman Russ encounters what appears to be an alternate version of himself. A Russ raised on Terra rather than Fenris, human in bearing, refined in manner, entirely unburdened by the death world that made him what he actually became. When Russ protests that he was stolen from his father's laboratories, the vision answers with a question that sits in the canon like a splinter. Were you? The Primarch executioner arriving on a harsh world of wolves, a being whose genetics mesh perfectly with the human strain found specifically there. A world of sagas and ancient stories, designed as though it were built for exactly the kind of hero who would rule it. The vision then laughs, low and quiet, remembering sharp teeth and hot meat. It asks Russ whether he thinks any of that is odd. Convenient, it calls it. The word lands like a verdict. And here is the thing. The Emperor knew what Fenris was before he ever set foot on it. He knew what a death world built around wolves and saga and brutal survival would produce in a man.
and Leman Russ, the Primarch designed to function as the Emperor's executioner of wayward Primarchs, the being sent to Prospero to bring Magnus to heel, the wolf who could be aimed at his own brothers without philosophical paralysis, is exactly what that kind of world produces. The vision in Wolfsbane is a being of the warp. Its veracity within the canon is deliberately uncertain, but the Emperor knew what Fenris was. He collected Russ from it when Russ was exactly what that world had made him. Go through the others, because the pattern holds across enough of them to constitute an argument rather than a coincidence. Horus Lupercal landed on Tithonia, a mining world of gang warfare so close to Terra it was practically in the Emperor's shadow, close enough to smell but always unreachable, always just outside the safety of what the emerging Imperium was building. He grew into a culture where leadership wasn't inherited but seized, where loyalty was the only stable social currency in a world that otherwise ate its own, where reading the room with perfect accuracy was the difference between commanding a gang and dying in a tunnel with your rivals standing over you. He became the most personally magnetic commander in human history, the War Master, the only being in the galaxy who could hold together 20 Primarchs and 1,000 Astartes legions through sheer force of personality rather than formal authority. That quality, the specific charisma that makes men follow you into situations where following you should be irrational, isn't something you teach in a laboratory. You get it from a world where the alternative to understanding people perfectly is a knife between your ribs. Robute Gilliman landed on Macragge, in the Eastern Fringe, on a world that had preserved functional institutions and constitutional governance across the age of strife. A rare thing, almost unique, the kind of civilizational continuity that produces administrators rather than warlords. Macragge treated the science of war as a high academic discipline. It treated political governance the same way. By age 10, Gilliman had mastered everything its tutors could teach him. By 12, he was commanding expeditionary forces against the Illyrians in the barbarous northern territories, fighting a brilliant campaign and earning not just submission, but respect from the warrior bands he defeated. He returned from that campaign to find his adoptive father's co-consul had staged a coup, executed the uprising, avenged Conor, and unified the entire planet. He was still a teenager in Terran years. Macragge produced the most administratively capable Primarch in existence. The man who wrote the Codex Astartes. The man who rebuilt the Imperium from the wreckage of the heresy.
The man who is still doing it in the 41st millennium,
10,000 years later, because the system he designed is durable enough to outlast everything that has tried to destroy it. That administrative genius, the ability to build functional institutions in a hostile environment rather than simply winning battles, comes from a world that preserved functional institutions through one of the most hostile eras in human history, not from a lab. Fulgrim landed on Chemos, an industrial world that had been great once and was obsessed with recovering that greatness through perfection and disciplined excellence. He arrived as an infant and grew into a culture that measured itself by what it had lost and how close it could get to recovering it. He rebuilt the planet. That cultural architecture, the obsession with flawlessness as the only acceptable standard, the treatment of imperfection as a personal failure rather than an ordinary human condition, became the defining characteristic of the Emperor's children before their fall. They were technically the most accomplished legion in the Crusade on a per-engagement basis. The Laeran campaign lasted a month. It was projected to take over a decade. Fulgrim's perfectionism made them capable of that. Chemos made Fulgrim's perfectionism the dominant organizing principle of his entire psychology. His vanity was already in him, built into his genome. Chemos didn't create it. It amplified it to weapon-grade precision, which made it simultaneously the source of his legion's extraordinary capability and the precise vulnerability a demon sword on Laren was designed to exploit. He fell to Slaanesh because his nature was already aligned with Slaanesh's domain in ways no upbringing on Terra would have changed. What Chemos gave him was the operational excellence that made the Emperor's children worth having. Magnus the Red landed on Prospero, among scholars and psychers. He deepened an obsession with sorcery and forbidden knowledge in an environment that celebrated and rewarded exactly those qualities, gave him teachers capable of engaging his mind, gave him a culture that treated arcane knowledge as a legitimate field of study rather than an abomination. He became the most psychically powerful Primarch in the legions, capable of feats of sorcery that most psychers couldn't approach. He also became dangerously certain of his own judgment and pathologically unable to accept external constraints on his pursuit of knowledge. The Emperor warned him repeatedly. Magnus ignored the warnings repeatedly. At Nicaea, the Emperor's explicit decree against sorcery was issued specifically because Magnus was pushing boundaries that would lead somewhere catastrophic. Magnus went ahead. He broke the webway. He doomed Prospero. His nature drove that outcome. The obsession with knowledge at the expense of discipline, the certainty that his understanding exceeded everyone else's. These weren't things Prospero installed in him. They were things Prospero gave a home to. Angron is the hardest case in the Forge argument, and it needs to be named as such directly, rather than folded into a clean pattern that doesn't exist. Nuceria didn't forge Angron. Nuceria broke him. He was enslaved. He was forced to fight as a gladiator. He watched companions die in arena sand for the entertainment of people who owned him. The butcher's nails, surgical implants that amplified aggression beyond any human or even transhuman baseline, that punished every feeling except combat rage with chronic neurological pain, were installed in him against his will by the people who owned him on Nuceria, before any imperial contact existed, before the Crusade knew he was alive. The apparatus had replaced significant portions of Angron's brain by the time the Emperor found him. It couldn't be removed. The canon is explicit on this. The nails had been integrated too deeply, had replaced too much, for any technology available to reverse the damage.
When Archenland and the Emperor's own apothecaries examined Angron, the conclusion was the same: irreversible. He wasn't a man with wounds that love or stability or a maternal figure might have healed. He was a man with hardware where his capacity for peace used to be. His fall to Khorne wasn't a parenting failure. It was a structural inevitability written in metal before the Imperium had any knowledge he existed. The Emperor found him on Nuceria at the moment of his final rebellion, standing with the enslaved gladiators who had become his family, ready to die with them, the most human decision he ever made, and teleported him away. He left them to die. That wasn't a forge. That was a wound added to wounds. But the specific wound that destroyed Angron's mind was Nucerian, not imperial, and no proximity to the Emperor's palace would have undone it. This is why the Forge argument requires honesty about its own limits. Nuceria produced a broken weapon. Some of the scatter landings produced catastrophic outcomes. The galaxy as Forge isn't a perfect theory. It's a risk the Emperor was willing to accept because 20 Primarchs who survived brutal environments and emerged as dominant forces were worth the price of losing several to exactly that brutality. He had already calculated acceptable losses with the Thunder Warriors. He had already done this math once.
Now, address the talking point the community returns to constantly when this argument is made, because it has a name and it deserves to be named. The Guilliman argument. Guilliman is the most stable Primarch who ever lived, stable enough that his own emotional stability has become a lore meme, the running joke about the one son who turned out fine. The community explanation is that he had a loving maternal figure, Terra Uton, not some other name that circulates in community shorthand. Canonically, Terra Uton, Conor Guilliman's chief retainer, later confirmed as his seneschal, described in the Lexicanum as a strong-willed, boisterous, and capable woman who helped raise him on Macragge and retained her position through the Great Crusade. The relationship was real, meaningful, and documented. Dan Abnett wrote it into the unremembered empire with genuine emotional weight. Scenes between Guilliman and Terra Uton that carry the specific texture of a relationship that has been long and real and mutually sustaining. This isn't minor footnote lore. Abnett cared about it. The canon cares about it. But the claim the Guilliman argument makes is more specific than the relationship was meaningful. The claim is that maternal care is the primary variable that explains Guilliman's stability, that what saved him from the fractures that broke his brothers was being loved by a mother figure, that without Terra Uton he would have fallen, that if the traitor Primarchs had been similarly loved, they might have held. No canonical source supports this as the primary causal explanation. Macragg's civic culture, its preserved institutions, its quasi-constitutional governance, its treatment of both warfare and administration as serious intellectual disciplines, is equally credited in everything the lore tells us about what shaped him. His innate temperament, consistently described as coldly rational, organizationally focused, and emotionally disciplined in ways that make him the most reliable mind in a room, is itself a factor independent of any maternal bond. At age 10, before Terra Uton's influence could have been the dominant shaping force, he had already mastered everything Macragg's tutors could teach him. At 12, he was commanding military campaigns. The analytical architecture was already present. What raised Guilliman wasn't only Terra Uton. What raised Guilliman was Macragge and Terra Uton, and the specific nature built into his genome, in a combination where the third element is genuinely present but not individually decisive.
The Guilliman argument also collapses when you apply it to Corvus Corax. Corax had adoptive parents, an older couple on deliverance who had never had a child, and raised him with genuine care and love. He isn't the second most stable Primarch in the legions by any reasonable metric. He ended the heresy by conducting gene experiments on his own legion that transformed his sons into monstrous creatures he couldn't control, and then vanished into the eye of terror with the word nevermore, leaving behind a traumatized legion in ruins. A mother figure didn't save him from the damage that Deliverance and the Horus Heresy accumulated around him. It gave him a foundation that was still insufficient when the weight became great enough. Two Primarchs with loving adoptive parents. One outcome that looks like stability. One outcome that does not. The variable that differed isn't the presence or absence of maternal care. The variables that differed are everything else. The world, the nature, the specific psychological architecture each one brought to the same general condition of being raised by someone who loved them. The falls to chaos deserve the same precision, because the mainstream narrative uses them as evidence of the Emperor's parental failure, and they aren't that. Lorgar is the hardest case. His faith-seeking was intrinsic. He was building temples before the Emperor repudiated him, writing religious texts, treating the Great Crusade as a sacred mission when it was officially anything but. His need to believe in something transcendent enough to organize his life around was built into the architecture of who he was.
But the Monarchia event can't be framed as simply background noise in an argument about chaos and intrinsic nature. The Emperor sent Guilliman and the Ultramarines to Monarchia, the greatest city Lorgar had built in his honor, a monument of extraordinary scale and devotion, and had it destroyed. Completely. Then he had the entire Word-Bearers Legion forced to kneel in the ashes, while Guilliman delivered the rebuke. That wasn't passive absence operating at a distance. That was the Emperor's active, direct intervention, and it accelerated what was already fragile in Lorgar into something that broke in a specific direction. Lorgar's fall is the clearest single case where the Emperor's behavior contributed to the outcome, rather than merely failing to prevent it. This script isn't going to argue otherwise, but acknowledge what the Monarchia event actually demonstrates. Not that the Emperor was a bad parent in any conventional emotional sense, but that the Emperor made a calculated decision to humiliate Lorgar in a way that served his other purposes, establishing the secular authority of the Ultramarines, establishing the limits of religious deviation within the Crusade, and accepted the damage it would do to Lorgar's psychology as part of the acceptable cost. He knew what breaking Lorgar publicly would do to Lorgar. He did it anyway. That isn't parental failure through neglect. That is the Emperor's standard operating procedure applied to a Primarch who had become inconvenient, with the same cold acceptance of collateral consequence he applied to the Thunder Warriors. Angron's damage, as already established, predates Imperial contact entirely. The Butcher's nails were installed by Nucerians. His psychological destruction was industrial in origin and neurological in mechanism. Nothing the Emperor could have done differently would have reached the hardware already welded into his brain. Magnus chose to ignore direct warnings from the Emperor. Not once. Repeatedly. At Nicaea, the Emperor made the prohibition explicit, public, and formal.
Magnus continued anyway, because his certainty in his own judgment exceeded his willingness to accept external constraint, a trait that was intrinsic, that Prospero amplified, and that no amount of proximity to a father figure would have changed without changing what Magnus fundamentally was. Fulgrim's vanity was built into him before Chemos. The demon sword on Laerin found an alignment that already existed in his psychology and exploited it. His fall to Slaanesh runs through his own nature more than through any environmental wound. The falls to chaos came from intrinsic fracture lines, decades of warp manipulation by entities with 10,000 years of experience in corrupting exactly these kinds of minds, and the specific psychological architectures that made each Primarch vulnerable to the specific chaos power that eventually claimed them. Reducing any of that to a parenting argument, to an absence of maternal figures or paternal warmth, isn't a lore position. It's an emotional shorthand for something too large and too dark to be explained by something as small as absent fathers. The community talking point that a loving upbringing would have saved the traitor Primarchs assumes that their falls were primarily caused by emotional deprivation rather than by what they were. The lore does not support this. The falls were overdetermined by nature, by chaos, by specific catastrophic events. Angron's nails, Lorgar's Monarchia, Fulgrim's demon sword, and no maternal warmth operates on neurological hardware or resists thousands of years of warp manipulation by entities operating at the scale of the Chaos Gods. Now step back and look at the whole sequence laid out in order. A woman of immense power and intimate knowledge, working inside the Emperor's most critical strategic project, driven by genuine maternal horror at his plans. She acts. She sabotages the wards. The Chaos Gods scatter the pods across the galaxy. The Emperor, the most powerful human psyker in history, operating in his own facility, holds the roof up with his mind, evacuates everyone, saves all the data,
and does not stop the event happening around him. The two people who know him best immediately conclude the project has failed. The Emperor, within moments, knows his assets are alive. He begins constructing the legions. He then spends 180 years collecting 20 demigods, one by one, from across the galaxy. He does not collect them in cartographic order. He does not work outward from Terra in any pattern that a genuine search would produce. He finds Guilliman in the eastern fringe, one of the farthest points from Terra in the galaxy, in 837 M30, well before the 17th Primarch, Corax, was discovered. He arrives at each world at a pivotal moment in each Primarch's life, not in the middle of their development, at the end of it, when the instrument is finished. 3 of those instruments arrived independently at the same conclusion about whether any of this was accidental: Guilliman, Sanguinius, Conrad Kurz. 3 beings among the most analytically capable in human history, arriving at the same conclusion from separate positions without coordinating the theory. Malcador confirmed that he and the Emperor had already designed a process to purge the unmanageable Primarchs using the Primarchs themselves, exactly as the Thunder Warriors had been purged, and that the Horus Heresy was a version of that process, executed more catastrophically than intended. The Emperor told Archon Land directly that the Primarchs were tools bred to serve a purpose. And Erda, in Warhawk, speaks in the voice of someone still constructing a story in which she is the protagonist. I acted to prevent an escalation, something terribly wrong, a twisting of what our ascension was supposed to be. I never acted to aid your... She stops. She doesn't finish the sentence. That ellipsis matters.
It's the gap between what she intended and what she understood about what actually happened. She believed she was making the choice. She believed she was the rebel who saved her children. She spent her immortality under the weight of what the choice actually produced, without ever fully accounting for the fact that, as the broader picture establishes, she was unwittingly used by chaos to commit it, and that chaos wasn't the only party with an interest in her act succeeding. She was the mechanism. She wasn't the architect. There is no smoking gun in the lore. No scene exists in which Neoth turns to Malcador and says the words. What there is, a pattern of behavior spanning tens of thousands of years, a demonstrated willingness to sacrifice loyal assets when their purpose is served, a direct canonical statement about the instrumental nature of the Primarchs, an immediate recovery that looks like a contingency plan executed rather than an improvisation forced on him, a discovery sequence that defies geographic logic but aligns with the logic of collecting finished instruments at their peak, and 3 of the 20 most perceptive beings humanity ever produced, all arriving independently at the same conclusion about whether any of this was accidental. The alternative, that the most capable strategic mind in human history was genuinely outsmarted by someone who loved his children more than he did, that he was shocked and helpless, and that the 180-year aftermath just happened to produce exactly the kind of galaxy-hardened warriors a hostile universe requires more faith in incompetence than the evidence allows. His precognition wasn't perfect. He couldn't see exactly what night Erda would open the wards, or precisely which worlds the pods would reach, or which suns would survive what the galaxy did to them. The warp keeps those details obscured. What he could see, with the certainty of nearly 40,000 years of watching human nature and strategic systems, was where the process was heading. The destination, not the path. He knew Erda's grief and her capability would eventually reach a breaking point. He knew that 20 demigods forged by the worst environments in the galaxy would be more useful than
20 demigods raised in safety. He knew what the Thunder Warriors had told him about the limits of controlled development. He left the wards in a state that an angry, powerful, grief-stricken woman could sabotage. He held the roof up when it collapsed. He evacuated his people and his data, and then he waited for his sons to finish being made. The Thunder Warriors were bred in controlled conditions. They were unstable, chaos-susceptible, and had to be killed by the custodians when their purpose was served. The Primarchs were scattered. 11 stayed loyal through a civil war that killed billions and nearly ended humanity. Guilliman rebuilt what the survivors inherited. He is still building it. Erda called what she did a rescue. The outcome looks like the most brutal training program in the history of the species. The Emperor didn't lose his sons to a mother's grief. He outsourced the hardest part of their military conditioning to the galaxy itself and let Erda take the blame. Subscribe for more stories like this.